The 1990s, a decade that birthed more musical genres than any other in history. From grunge to nu metal, trip-hop to neo-soul, the 90s reshaped the sonic landscape in ways we're still unpacking today.
Hmm, that's quite a bold claim. What makes you say the 90s were so revolutionary for music?
Well, it's all about the sheer diversity and innovation we saw during that decade. Let's start with one of the most prominent trends, the continuation of teen pop and dance pop from the 80s. Artists like Britney Spears and the Backstreet Boys were dominating the charts, building on the foundations laid by their predecessors.
Oh, yeah, those catchy tunes were everywhere. But wasn't there also a huge shift happening in hip hop during this time?
Absolutely. The 90s saw hip-hop's golden age reach its peak, with artists pushing the boundaries of the genre and gaining massive mainstream popularity. We're talking about legends like Tupac, Notorious B.I.G., and Nas, who weren't just creating incredible music, but shaping the culture at large.
And it wasn't just hip hop that was thriving, right? I remember there being a lot of genre blending going on.
You're spot on. The 90s were like a musical melting pot, with artists constantly experimenting and fusing different styles. Take New Jack Swing, for instance. It blended hip-hop with R&B and pop, giving us hits from artists like Belle Biv DeVoe and Bobby Brown. Then there was neo-soul, bringing a more introspective, organic sound to R&B with artists like D'Angelo and Erykah Badu.
That's fascinating. It seems like every corner of the music world was evolving. What about rock music? Didn't it undergo a pretty significant transformation in the 90s?
Oh, absolutely. The 90s marked a complete departure from the glam metal and new wave-dominated 80s rock scene. Grunge burst onto the stage and changed everything. Bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam brought a raw, angsty sound that resonated with a whole generation. Kurt Cobain's introspective lyrics and distorted guitar riffs became the soundtrack for disaffected youth across the world.
Mm-hmm. I remember how huge Nirvana was. But grunge wasn't the only rock subgenre making waves, was it?
Not at all. We saw the rise of Britpop in the UK, with bands like Oasis and Blur bringing a distinctly British flavor to rock music. Industrial rock, led by Nine Inch Nails, brought a harsh electronic edge to the genre. And by the end of the decade, nu metal was blending elements of hip-hop and alternative metal, with bands like Korn and Limp Bizkit at the forefront.
Wow, that's quite a range. And you know what's interesting? While all this was happening in rock, electronic music was having its own renaissance, right?
Exactly. The 90s saw electronic music explode in popularity. House and techno, which had started gaining traction in the 80s, became mainstream. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Berlin became epicenters for electronic music innovation. But it didn't stop there. New subgenres were popping up left and right. Rave culture gave birth to happy hardcore, drum and bass emerged from the UK garage scene, and trip-hop blended elements of hip-hop, electronica, and ambient music.
It's amazing how many new genres and subgenres emerged in electronic music during the 90s. But it wasn't just confined to clubs and raves, was it?
Not at all. Electronic influences were seeping into mainstream pop and rock as well. Artists like Björk and Radiohead were incorporating electronic elements into their music, creating hybrid sounds that defied easy categorization. And in the pop world, producers like Timbaland were using innovative electronic production techniques to create futuristic R&B and hip-hop tracks.
So, it seems like the 90s were all about innovation and breaking boundaries. But wasn't there also a nostalgic element to some of the music?
You're absolutely right. Alongside all this innovation, we saw the revival of older styles in new contexts. The third wave of ska brought the horn-heavy sound of 60s Jamaican music back into the spotlight, but with a modern rock twist. Bands like No Doubt and Sublime were at the forefront of this movement. And then there was the swing revival, with groups like Big Bad Voodoo Daddy bringing the sounds of the 1940s into the 1990s.
That's such an interesting contrast. And what about country music? Didn't it see a significant rise in popularity during the 90s?
Oh, definitely. The 90s saw contemporary country music break into the mainstream in a big way. Artists like Garth Brooks and Shania Twain were topping not just the country charts, but the pop charts as well. Brooks, in particular, became one of the best-selling artists of all time, bringing a rock-influenced sound and high-energy performances to country music.
It's fascinating how country music managed to evolve while still maintaining its distinct identity. And this wasn't just happening in the US, right? The 90s saw some interesting developments in European music as well.
Absolutely. In Europe, techno and rave culture were huge. The Love Parade in Berlin, for example, grew from a small gathering of 150 people in 1989 to over 1 million attendees by the end of the 90s. But it wasn't all about electronic beats. Reggae also found a strong following in Europe during this time, with artists like Gentleman from Germany gaining popularity.
Well, it really goes to show how interconnected the global music scene had become by the 90s. Genres and styles were crossing borders and influencing each other in ways we hadn't seen before.
Exactly. And that's what makes the 90s such a fascinating decade for music. It was a time of incredible diversity and innovation, where multiple genres could coexist and thrive, each finding its audience and making its mark on the cultural landscape. Whether you were into pop, rock, hip-hop, electronic, or country, there was something for everyone.
So, do you think that's why 90s music continues to resonate with people today?
I think that's a big part of it. The 90s laid the groundwork for so much of what we hear in modern music. Many of today's artists cite 90s musicians as major influences, and we're still feeling the effects of the genre blending and experimentation that happened during that decade. But it's not just about the music itself. It's also about what it represented.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the 90s were a time of significant cultural and technological change. The music of the decade both reflected and influenced these shifts. Take the rise of the Internet, for example. It was just starting to change how people discovered and shared music. Napster, launched in 1999, would go on to revolutionize and disrupt the music industry in ways we're still grappling with today.
Oh, right. I remember the whole Napster controversy. So you're saying the music wasn't just about the sound, but also about the broader cultural context?
Exactly. The 90s were a time of rapid change and innovation, and nowhere was this more evident than in the world of music. As we look back on this decade, it's clear that its impact on popular music can't be overstated. The 90s gave us so many iconic artists, albums, and songs that continue to be celebrated today. It was a decade that pushed boundaries, challenged norms, and ultimately reshaped the musical landscape in ways we're still exploring.
Well said. It seems like the 1990s were truly a pivotal decade in the evolution of popular music.
Indeed. And as we wrap up our discussion, I think it's worth noting that the musical legacy of the 1990s is one that continues to influence and inspire artists and listeners alike. It was a decade that celebrated diversity, pushed boundaries, and ultimately changed the course of popular music forever. Whether you're revisiting old favorites or discovering 90s classics for the first time, there's always something new to appreciate about this incredible decade in music history.
You've summed it up perfectly. The 90s were a musical kaleidoscope, constantly shifting and creating new patterns. It's no wonder we're still talking about and listening to this music today.
Absolutely. And as we continue to see the influence of 90s music in today's artists and genres, it's clear that the decade's impact is far from over. The spirit of innovation and genre blending that defined the 90s continues to shape the music we listen to today. So, whether you're a fan of grunge, hip-hop, electronic music, or any other genre that flourished in the 90s, there's no denying the lasting impact of this transformative decade on the world of music.